This is the 6th hearing in our subcommittee series on the crisis of violent white supremacy, something the members know we have been following closely for several years now. For more than 2 years, we have worked to explore various aspects of this worsening crisis in American democracy and to urge the federal government to prioritize a robust and comprehensive response. I want to play a quick video that sums up our prior hearings, particularly the need for an executive branch-wide strategy to address the rise in domestic violent extremism. I'm relieved that we can finally have a hearing today to discuss exactly what that strategy is now. And this strategy incorporates many of the recommendations that our subcommittee has been working for in prior hearings. Please play that video if you would. Today is the subcommittee's first hearing on how America is addressing the rise of a particular form of domestic terrorism, violent white supremacy. Our purpose is to examine the scope and nature of this terrorism, understand the problems the government has in collecting relevant data about it, analyze what the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are doing and should be doing to address it, and then to ask whether the administration is devoting attention and resources commensurate to the magnitude of the threat. And we heard from a number of witnesses about the consequences of the government not acting to meet the threat, including from Susan Bro, the mother of Heather Heyer, who was the young woman killed by white supremacists in Charlottesville 2 years ago. We heard also from former FBI and Department of Homeland Security officials on what the agencies are doing today and not doing and should be doing in response. One message came through loud and clear at that hearing. White supremacists today constitute the most significant threat of domestic terror in the United States, but the federal government lacks a comprehensive and cohesive strategy for addressing the problem. The Department of Homeland Security appears to have no overall strategic plan for how to counter and prevent white supremacist violence. We also need to hear from the Department of Homeland Security to answer a fundamental question. Do we have an overall strategic plan to counter and prevent the threat of white supremacist violence? I fear the answer is no. Our prior hearings have called both the FBI and DHS to task for failing to develop a plan to address white supremacy. We invited the FBI to come today. The Bureau refused to come, claiming it has nothing to say because they have no evidence that this is a widespread problem demanding the FBI's attention. The so-called patriots who stormed the Capitol are domestic extremists whose paramilitary activities are not protected by any part of the Constitution of the United States. We need a coherent strategy that provides state law enforcement with adequate resources to coordinate regional responses to this threat and appropriately addresses the sweeping dangers of this organized paramilitary movement against American democracy. So, good morning, everyone, and I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I want to thank all the members who've come to participate in this critical hearing. As you just saw in the video compilation, the hearing is 6th in a series about the nation's crisis with violent white supremacy and the need for the government to mount an effective and comprehensive response to this fundamental threat to the safety of the American people and the security of the American Republic. This is not just an important, but today's is an historic hearing because for the first time, an administration has answered our call to set forth a comprehensive whole-of-government strategy to deal with the threat. The Biden administration took power only 2 weeks after the January 6th insurrection. That day, the whole world watched the stormtroopers of violent white supremacy act as the vanguard of a mass violent political insurrection against the government of the United States that smashed our windows, invaded our Capitol, wounded and injured more than 140 Capitol police officers and Metropolitan Police Department officers, and left several people dead. The protest that turned into a riot and an insurrection had been promoted and incited by then-President Donald Trump. The well-trained battalions of domestic violent extremists consisted of Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, QAnon followers, Aryan Nations, Boogaloo Boys, armed militiamen, white Christian nationalists, and other violent extremists. They rallied behind the banner of Donald Trump's big lie, asserting that he had won the 2020 presidential election and that it was being stolen from him. In fact, Joe Biden received more than 7 million votes more than Donald Trump and won by a margin of 306 to to 232 in the Electoral College. And yet, Trump's big lie unified these disparate violent groups into a mass street movement to, quote, stop the steal and storm the Capitol to interrupt the counting of Electoral College votes for the very first time in the history of the United States, nearly toppling the peaceful transfer of power in our country. Although warning signs had been popping up everywhere for weeks before the insurrection, federal law enforcement never produced a formal threat assessment about the risks of violence on that day. That indicates a systematic failure to grapple with the magnitude of the threat facing the Republic. And let's be clear that the most dangerous domestic terror threat facing America today comes from the forces that attacked our government on January 6th. In October of 2020, President Trump's own acting Secretary of Homeland Security singled out white supremacist extremists as, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Just 2 days after being sworn in, President Biden ordered federal law enforcement and intelligence officials to study the threat of domestic violent extremism. He understood that a post-9/11 counterterrorism framework set up primarily to combat international threats like Al-Qaeda and ISIS was not designed to address the domestic terrorist violence that threatens us today. The results of their review became public on June 15th when the president released the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. The strategy outlined 4 main pillars to guide federal agencies. First, the strategy calls for more analysis and information sharing related to domestic terror threats. Second, it asks agencies to determine how to better prevent domestic terror recruitment and mobilization of violence. Third, it tasks the government with disrupting and deterring domestic terrorism. And fourth, it calls on the government to confront long-term contributors to domestic terror, including racism. This strategy offers exactly the kind of coordinated governmental response that members of this subcommittee have been asking for more than 2 years. During our prior hearings, we were warned over and over again by witnesses with years of counterterror experience and federal law enforcement experience that the Trump administration had no cohesive plan to confront the enormous problem facing us. We learned that the federal government was not devoting sufficient personnel or resources to monitor or confront the white supremacist threat of violence spreading across the globe. In fact, we heard from Trump administration officials themselves that the administration, frankly, lacked any strategic plan to prevent or combat white supremacist violence. With the release of this new strategy, the administration has finally ensured that the U.S. has a blueprint to defend ourselves. The strategy calls for more resources to boost state, local, tribal, and territorial efforts to tackle the threat. This includes more information sharing, more analysis, and data-driven guidance on potential indicators of violence. It also lays out a new public health-focused framework for terror prevention that will enlist all sectors of government and society to work together as a bulwark against violence and provide an off-ramp for those who are caught up in the clutches of hate. These sweeping objectives will require enormous implementation efforts, coordination, and oversight. I hope we can use this hearing to explore how these efforts are already underway and what Congress can do to help. We should also take this opportunity to discuss how the administration's strategy will balance its urgent investigative and enforcement priorities with the constant need to uphold the civil rights and civil liberties of all Americans. I'm confident that the witnesses before us today will be able to clarify how these counterterror efforts will respect the rule of law and democracy, the democracy that we, in fact, are seeking to protect against terrorist violence. We're facing an unprecedented situation in which political leaders, up to and including a former president, have been actively promoting corrosive, anti-democratic messages that circulate paranoia, cynicism, and violence. This cesspool of conspiracy thinking is activating unstable individuals predisposed because of a mixture of ideological grievances and personal disappointments to commit violence. This is a problem that demands the attention of all of us, and indeed, everyone in the country who believes in the constitutional order. On January 6th, we saw a glimpse of a post-democratic, chaotic America. In that violent mob, which stormed the Capitol of the United States, there was no room for civil rights or civil liberties for anyone, either for the marchers or for the officers who are being beat up, or the American people, or the Congress. There was no room for equal justice under law. There was no room for meaningful dissent. Our government has finally woken up to the need to combat comprehensively and effectively white supremacist and militia-based violent extremism. I hope that this hearing will bring more clarity and exposure to the Biden administration's strategic plan and help illuminate what Congress can do to ensure that it is both effective and, of course, respectful of the civil rights and civil liberties of the people. We must all work together to defend our democracy and our freedom. And with that, I will invite our new ranking member to provide